All across the country, students, faculty, and community members are calling for their universities to divest. And UIUC is no exception.
We are asking for the divestment from all corporations and academic collaboration.
She says the university invests in funds connected to arms used against Palestinians.
If they're funding weapons manufacturers, to divest from those weapons manufacturers, especially as they are currently dropping bombs.
But where did this idea, this demand of divestment, come from? Why did students begin to target their university's financial investments to fight for change internationally? Well, a huge source for inspiration for these movements for divestment, whether it be divestment from the occupation of Palestine or fossil fuel companies, is the anti-apartheid struggle. This movement, most active at UIUC in the 1970s and 1980s, was one part of an international effort that successfully ended the apartheid system in South Africa. In today's episode, we're going to explore why divestment was chosen as a demand, what happened on our own campus during the anti-apartheid divestment movement, and what we can learn from it. Welcome back to another episode of the Learning and Labor podcast. My name is Nico Johnson Fuller, and I use he, him pronouns. Today's episode is something I've wanted to do for a while. In fact, I would say this is a big part of what inspired this podcast in the first place. A few years back, I took a class, Social Movement Communications, where we had to do research on a historical social movement at UIUC. My group decided to research the anti-apartheid movement, and through that project, I had my first experience researching UIUC's history and my first visit to the university archives. Ever since then, I've wanted to revisit this topic, and I felt like now was the perfect time to do it. And don't worry, this episode won't just be me talking the whole time. I did get the chance to interview Terri Barnes, a professor in history, gender, and women's studies, and the director of the Center for African Studies at UIUC. With Professor Barnes, we're going to go over some of the background of apartheid South Africa and what prompted the divestment movement. Then I'm going to dive into my own research and UIUC's movement for divestment before we conclude with some more of the interview and discussion with Professor Barnes and the implications of the movement as a whole. Before we get into this, I want to recognize that this episode would not at all be possible without the many others who have worked to document the anti-apartheid organizing here on campus, including many of the organizers themselves. In particular, I want to shout out the Champaign County Historical Archives at the Urbana Free Library, which has, I think, by far the most content about the anti-apartheid movement here at the University of Illinois. And I also want to mention the African Activist Archives, which has a lot of great stuff online, and the University Archives for a great access to a lot of primary sources. I also need to mention the honors thesis, Why Invest in Racism, by Shane Smith of Eastern Illinois University, which does an amazing job telling the story of this movement and was incredibly valuable. And finally, if you finished the episode and want to learn more about the movement, or just are interested in hearing more about some of these stories, there is a very informative panel discussion from 2016 by members of the Divest Now Coalition, which is available for free online, which I think was great at highlighting some really interesting stories from this movement. And as always, all these sources and many others will be linked in the episode description. With that being said, let's get this episode started by discussing the historical moment of the 1970s with Professor Barnes.
It therefore seems to me most important that you, the people of the state of Illinois, should know your university. Is it doing what you want it to do as the people's university? You are the owners, and your decision is final. Learning and labor. For the people and by the people. The people's university.
So my name is Terri Barnes. Everybody calls me Terri. I am a professor of history and gender and women's studies here at the University of Urbana, Illinois, Champaign. My academic background is I have a BA in international relations from Brown University from a long time ago. Another BA degree, MA, and my PhD are from the University of Zimbabwe, where I studied African economic history, and I've been at UIUC since 2008.
Great. So I guess I also just wanted to ask, obviously, I remember from taking a class with you talking about this, but you studied in Zimbabwe, and the course I took with you was about Southern African history, and I'm just kind of curious what first got you interested in Southern Africa as a region more generally and its history.
Yeah. Originally, I went to Zimbabwe a couple of years after I graduated from Brown, I thought for 9 months to be a teacher, a volunteer teacher in a high school that had been, well, it was more like a high school program as opposed to an actual building, a high school program that had been set up for people who had fought in the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe and who were coming back to their community and wanted to resume their education. So that kind of dates this to about 1982. And I at that point, it was kind of a random decision that I made to go to Zimbabwe. I didn't have a background really in Africans. I had traveled to Africa once before, but I didn't have a background in teaching or in history. So it was just one of the sort of things that people do when they're in their mid-20s and they're looking for interesting things to do. So I found myself in Zimbabwe teaching at this school that was called Daniko, Danhiko, Daniko Secondary School. And I met all these amazing people, and I really enjoyed what I was being asked to do. I learned a lot, and I just decided to stay for another year, and then another year, and then one thing led to another. I decided that I was really interested in Zimbabwean history. It was a really exciting time to be a historian in Zimbabwe. People were literally rewriting and rediscovering and reworking their understandings of what history meant in Zimbabwe, and so one thing kind of led to another for me.
That's really interesting. Okay, so I guess to kind of provide some background context for a lot of what I've been researching and things more related to the University of Illinois, I guess I just want to talk a little bit about where things were in South Africa in the 1970s. And, you know, apartheid had existed as a system for a while already. And of course, there's a larger colonial history. And I guess I was wondering if you'd be able to just give a summary of what the conditions were like in 1970 in South Africa, which is about when the student movement really started to swing into force in the United States.
South Africa had been governed by the very strict segregationist, white supremacist movement principles known as apartheid, which had come into power. The political party that espoused apartheid had come into power in 1948. So from the late 40s through the 50s and the 60s, very draconian, I guess you could say, laws that were trying to put white supremacy into place in all aspects of South African society. One law after another, one policy after another had been developed in order to do that. So in housing, in education, in labor, and certainly in politics, apartheid was flowering, actually, and people's resistance to it, which had been a very long-standing, had also been developing in different ways. So I can't really give you an example of what life was like in South Africa in 1970, but it was like a period of, the storm was coming. I think people's lives were very difficult. The lives of Black and brown people in South Africa were very difficult. There's a lot of history that people still have to do and that people still have to write, and oral histories that people still have to work on in terms of like how circumscribed people's lives were in this particular period. I say that because there is a narrative that says that the 1950s were a period of kind of civil disobedience and upheaval, leading to the Sharpeville massacre of 1960. And then there's a narrative that says that between 1960 and about 1976, inside South Africa, things were relatively quiet, which isn't exactly correct. The resistance movements that were later called the liberation movements were developing largely in exile in this period, but there was development of internal opposition. By internal, I mean inside the country as opposed to in exile. And specifically, there was the Black consciousness movement that started in the late 1960s, led by a number of young Black university students at the time. Steve Biko, Barney Petiana, Mampela Rampele, a whole group of young students, young university students at the time. And the reason that I mention that is because the next kind of event that the world, like people in Illinois, would have noticed in South Africa was the 1976 Soweto uprising of students, young students, middle school and high school students in the small city called Soweto, which is outside Johannesburg. And the connection with the Black consciousness movement from the 1960s was that some of the teachers in those schools had been Black consciousness members of the Black consciousness movement. So when students decided that they didn't want to, those middle school and high school students in Soweto in June 1976 decided that they were going to hold a demonstration because they didn't want to be taught exclusively in the settler colonial language of Afrikaans. They did that having had political education from people who had been in the Black consciousness movement maybe for 6 to 8 years already. So there's a lot of continuity there in the development of political consciousness in South Africa, even though at the time it seemed like the African National Congress, which was largely, not completely, but largely centered outside the country, and the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, or the PAC, which was also largely outside the country, they were not that present inside South Africa through the early part of the 1970s. So I think all of that is to say that when the Soweto uprising came about and led to the deaths of many children, basically children and teenagers at the hands of the South African police in Soweto and also around the country, thousands of other high school students around the country followed the example of their colleagues in Soweto, and thousands were arrested, detained without trial, tortured, killed by the South African system in 1976, and that really galvanized my understanding is that really galvanized the anti-apartheid movement in places like, here on this campus in Illinois, because that had been such a large-scale atrocity in 1976.
Yeah, that's absolutely something that I've seen mentioned repeatedly, the Soweto uprising, as well as the death of Steve Biko the next year.
1977, September 1977, yeah.
Yes. That was something, I think the death of Steve Biko, in documents from the University of Illinois, I've seen Steve Biko mentioned more often, in fact, as very often it seems like there was events commemorating the anniversary of his death and in memory of him on campus. I guess the question I had for you, I mean, you kind of already went over the fact that these were very brutal, they were well documented, and it seems like these were the things that really broke through internationally, or at least specifically to young people in the United States. But they weren't, of course, the first acts of resistance or acts of brutality in South Africa. Is there anything else about these events you think was particularly impactful?
There was media and photography was really important in the 76 rebellion, specifically the photography of that rebellion and of that particular student uprising. I mean, even today, when we have instantaneous media and the sharing of images around the world, those paths are very well trodden, and certainly the images of the death of Hector Pieterse, who was a young student from 1976, really literally flashed around the world. That really demonstrated the brutality, of the, people used to say, the apartheid regime. This was the anti-apartheid movement, both the one that was carried out by South Africans and by people in solidarity with them around the world. It had a lot of moving parts to it, and it's sometimes hard to remember that in addition to movements inside the country, liberation movements outside the country, efforts, for example, at the United Nations to isolate South Africa. Well, first to declare apartheid, I think, a crime against humanity, then to isolate South Africa at the United Nations and to, lessen its ability to find allies around the world and support around the world. I mean, these were all things that there was a cultural boycott that the ANC called. I'm not sure exactly when that started, but cultural boycott meant that people who wanted to reduce the legitimacy of the apartheid government would not buy goods that were made in South Africa, would not invite South African sports figures or speakers or academics, to participate in programming, that people would not go to South Africa to if they were an artist, like a musician, they wouldn't go to South Africa to sing or to perform, things like that. They wouldn't play sports with South African teams and things like that, which sounds a little, on the one hand, it sounds a little kind of trivial, but I think if you lived in South Africa and you were a white South African, it was very annoying. It was very annoying that the rugby team could not play in the World Cup, or it was very annoying that the best South African tennis players could not play at Wimbledon and things like that. And it really did, those things did increase that sense of isolation, and that the world was telling white South Africa that what it was doing was wrong. And then when it came to economic boycotts and divestment, which I think you're going to ask me about in a minute, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. You're getting ahead of all my questions here, which is great, okay, honestly.
I'll slow down.
No, it's not a problem. It's great.
Yeah. Well, I was just saying that all of these things, it's hard to keep track of all of the way that the anti-apartheid movement was really a network of different kinds of efforts to either slow down or delegitimize the idea of white supremacy and apartheid.
Yeah, so you obviously mentioned divestment. I definitely do want to get into that. I guess one other question I had, which I was wondering was, as we talk a little bit about the university, I was wondering if there was a academic boycott as well for South Africa, and just generally what the connections were like between universities in the United States and South Africa.
That is a good question. South African universities were highly segregated and not very well regarded internationally, I guess I would say. I'm sorry, I'm struggling to kind of work out how to balance something like the first heart transplant in the world happened basically through South African medicine, through the University of Cape Town's medical school. So there were certain ways that knowledge that was generated during the apartheid era spread out into the world. For example, around some medical issues and the first heart transplant. Which I'm gonna say 67, but I could be wrong about that. Anyway, but in terms of like the humanities and the social sciences, I really don't think there was a lot of that South African academics had a lot of purchase in it's not in the United States. This is not to say that there wasn't a fair amount of political connection. I've always wanted to, something I never have gotten around to yet. Like I always wanted to write an article about Barry Goldwater going to South Africa. There were connections between right-wing anti-communists in the United States and the apartheid government, because it also styled itself as being against communism. So there were lots of links, but I guess I want to say that in other ways that because people didn't regard the humanities and the social science work that was coming out of South Africa, particularly highly. I don't think that. I mean, there was an academic boycott, but I don't think it really hurt anybody all that much. I think the other cultural boycotts around the arts I could be wrong about that. I can imagine somebody really disagreeing with me there, but I think around the arts and sports that those cultural boycotts were more impactful.
Yeah, that does make sense. I guess I wasn't really that aware of what the perceived status of South African universities are, so I can see why that may not be as relevant of a target. With all that in mind, a lot of U.S. campuses, as you obviously know and mentioned already, were focused on divestment as in terms of the anti-apartheid organizations and their goals. And I guess I was just wondering if you could touch on maybe why that specifically was decided upon as a goal and was placed so as the number one kind of target of these movements.
Sure. Well, my understanding of the origin of that movement is that it came out of the strategizing of American anti-apartheid NGOs, specifically one called Trans-Africa, that was, trying to think of ways that Americans could be organized, in the struggle against apartheid. Well, one of the fundamental goals of the apartheid system was to pull down the cost of black labor, to keep people's wages really, really low, so that they could be exploited in ways so that more wealth would flow to white South Africa. It was a pretty simple idea. So when companies like big American companies were looking for places to invest overseas and to build factories overseas and to develop new markets overseas, South Africa looked like quite an attractive proposition. The industrial infrastructure was relatively high. The road network is excellent. The airports are there, and that there was this large pool of what they were told was quiet black labor that was very cheap. So it looked like a great place to build a factory if you wanted to sell cars in Asia or something. It's halfway around the world. You could make cars in South Africa that you would sell in Australia or New Zealand or in Asia and so forth without having to, say, ship them from Ohio and so forth. So the economic history of the anti-apartheid movement here is also very much caught up in the economic history of American capitalism at this particular moment. So when an NGO like Trans-Africa was looking for strategies, they came across this really brilliant idea of getting Americans to criticize and to boycott the work of American companies that were invested in South Africa because of the cheap labor that was available there because of apartheid. So, that took a couple of different paths. You could either refuse to buy products that were sold in South Africa, that had been produced in South Africa, like unions could stand in solidarity with the developing unions in South Africa and refuse to offload products, that came to American ports that were coming from South Africa, and specifically on U.S. campuses. And then, as now, campuses invest their endowment funds in the stock market, and one could say we don't want the money that people have donated to our university or our tuition funds that are invested in the endowment. We don't want those funds to be profiting on the backs of South Africa's, people who are oppressed in South Africa because of apartheid. Why should we be getting high interest on our funds invested in Ford because Ford is making all this money in South Africa? That's wrong. We don't want to support that kind of relationship. So divestment was actually a really brilliant idea because it brought the problem home to American campuses. Every university had an endowment, some huge endowments, of course, like Harvard, some medium-sized endowments like ours, but even small universities and colleges had investments and endowments that might have some link to one of these growing American companies that had a presence in South Africa. Coca-Cola, GM, Ford, Kodak, IBM, Hewlett-Packard, they all had connections with South Africa that people could see that their campuses were connected to.
According to some notes at the archives, the first documented time divestment from apartheid came up at UIUC was in 1965, when a letter sent by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee advocating for divestment was rejected by the Board of Trustees Finance Committee. If you don't know, the Board of Trustees has pretty much the final say about everything on all 3 University of Illinois campuses, from Chicago to Springfield to here in Champaign-Urbana. In the 1970s and 80s, the trustees were actually an elected position, although they are now appointed by the governor. So, as apartheid began to grow in public consciousness, the board began to address these issues more often. In 1972, they once again rejected divestment, and they also approved a policy for the Finance Committee to review requests around quote-unquote undesirable consequences from their investments. But as I mentioned already, it was not until the late 70s when the divestment movement at UIUC really ramped up. The first big notable event here occurred in April of 1977, which was after the Soweto uprising, but before the death of Steve Biko. In a non-binding test of student support, the Student Government Association, known as SGA, held a referendum on divestment. With a little over 9% of the student population voting, those in favor of divestment won, with around 55% of the vote. In response, the Board of Trustees did not implement any significant policy changes. By the end of that year, 1977, Professor Dean McHenry, whose files are now the main source of information about the anti-apartheid movement at the university archives, began bringing the issue of divestment to the Board of Trustees directly. McHenry, along with some other students, faculties, and others, would soon form the Champaign-Urbana Coalition Against Apartheid, more commonly known by its abbreviation, CUCAA. From listening to some of the organizers talk, I realized that this wasn't normally read out like CUCAA, but they actually just said CUCA. So I'll try to stick to that. CUCA was a multiracial organization centered around fighting apartheid, and it had several main goals. The first goal was to educate and inform people at the university and in the community about conditions under the apartheid regime, something many people in the United States had very limited knowledge of. To accomplish this, they worked with local media, held many educational events, and created their own materials to distribute. The coalition's other goals included supporting liberation organizations, including the African National Congress, or the ANC. Direct material support for these groups was difficult, but CUCA was clear that they stood in solidarity with them. This was significant because these groups were not only illegal in South Africa, but considered terrorist organizations by the United States government. You might have heard that Nelson Mandela, an ANC leader and South Africa's first black president, was on the US terrorist watch list as late as 2008. This is true, as the US still had not gotten rid of many of its long-standing classifications of groups like the ANC, which was included on a list of terrorist groups by the Department of Defense in 1988. But beyond just supporting groups in South Africa, the coalition also fought for change locally, with the most concrete policy goal being divestment from companies complicit in apartheid. When CUCA was formed, UIUC had over $4 million invested in companies doing business in South Africa, and this number would only increase over the subsequent years. As we know from the referendum already held on campus by this point, divestment was supported by a majority of politically engaged students on campus. But to turn this support into actual policy change, the coalition would have to employ a number of tactics, including protest, consciousness raising, and nonviolent resistance. For an example of how this played out in practice, we can look at a CUCA leaflet from September 1978. This leaflet advertised an armband day and rally for Tuesday, September 12th at noon. Armbands were used on multiple occasions by CUCA to symbolize chains and the lack of freedom in South Africa. This symbolism was also present in the rally itself, where the arms of the iconic alma mater statue were symbolically chained. This event was described by the organizers as a tribute to the struggle for freedom, and specifically to Steve Biko, who had been killed by the South African police exactly 1 year prior. The same leaflet also advertised several film screenings of Last Grave at Dimbasa at the Illini Union. This powerful film about apartheid ends with the following quote.
During the hour you've been watching this film, in South Africa, 6 black families have been thrown out of their homes. 60 blacks have been arrested under the pass laws. And 60 black children have died of the effects of malnutrition. And during the same hour, the gold mining companies have made a profit of £35,000.
For context, that profit would be about $405,000 today. Culture, including movies like this, music, and poetry, would be an incredibly important part of KUKA's efforts to draw support for their movement. As noted in the honors thesis I mentioned earlier by Shane Smith, Peter Gabriel's song Biko was another particularly important example of music for this movement.
The outside world is black and white with only one color dead. Oh, Biko, Biko, Biko.
In their educational activities and practices, anti-apartheid organizers also stressed the connection of racism under apartheid to racism at home or in the United States. Some of their actions commemorated civil rights heroes like Martin Luther King Jr. And students also connected UIUC's historic practices of allowing racist groups like the student Ku Klux Klan I've covered in a previous podcast to their investment in apartheid. So, with KUKA up and running, they began demanding action from the university administration. When their demands were repeatedly ignored by the Board of Trustees, they planned a march on the office of the University of Illinois Foundation, which is the organization that manages the university's investments. Around 150 people marched there, but they were given no response. So, they sent a letter directly to University of Illinois President Corbally, and set a deadline to hear back for May 1st at noon. On May 1st, the protesters planned their response. What followed would be the first major act of nonviolent resistance against apartheid at UIUC. Over 120 people marched to the president's office, demanding to speak with him about his policy on apartheid South Africa. President Corbally hid from the protesters as they began a sit-in in his office. And when he did eventually emerge, he let them know that he thought it would be unprofitable to speak with them. Still, the protesters remained, demanding an explanation of the university's position. Eventually, after threatening students with arrest and expulsion, another administrator said that they would agree to a public debate. After continued pressure over the following months, the administration finally agreed to a date for this debate to happen. It would be at the Board of Trustees Finance Committee meeting in September. Generally, the administration defended themselves by claiming to care about the issue at hand, but insisting that they have no power to change anything about it. They refused to meet the students' demands and refused to divest from the companies that had become part of the apartheid system. As president of the Board of Trustees once argued, quote, "The companies aren't actually out there beating people." But with pressure continuing to build, the board decided it was finally time to take some kind of action to improve their public image. In early 1979, they would commit to only investing in companies which complied with the Sullivan Principles, which were named after Reverend Leon Sullivan, who proposed them. These principles, which include concepts like non-segregation and fair employment practices, were agreed to by multiple major corporations working in South Africa. And while they seem on a surface level to be an improvement for conditions of black workers, in practice, the Sullivan Principles did little to actually challenge apartheid. As a pamphlet from the American Committee on Africa, a national organization that fought apartheid, put it, quote, "The Sullivan Principles make no demand for change in the fundamental structure of apartheid, and no demand for black political rights," unquote. As a testament to the weakness of these principles at challenging apartheid, the South African government itself even supported the initiative. So, while KUKA clearly identified this step as a failure to meet their actual demands of divestment, it did look good to many people in the public. Reverend Sullivan was a corporate figure, a board member of General Motors, but he was also a respected civil rights leader. Many people believed that, with the Sullivan Principles, the board was committing to an agreement that would ensure they are actually working against apartheid. Because of this perception, along with experienced seniors graduating and less attention on apartheid in the media, there was a period of reduced activity for KUKA over the next few years. They continued to host events, for example, collaborating with the African Studies Department and other campus organizations, or hosting South African exiles for a speech, but their direct actions became more scarce. It was not until a few years later, in the early 1980s, that things would begin to heat up again. As the decade marched on, there would be an increase in press coverage of apartheid nationwide, and organizers in Champaign-Urbana would begin to strengthen their ties with their comrades throughout the country. This included several conferences held by the American Committee on Africa, where organizers regularly planned 2 weeks of national action. These weeks would become designated times to hold rallies, educational events, and other actions for divestment and against apartheid, and they helped draw more attention to the movement, both at UIUC and across the country. This kind of nationwide unity was especially critical in this historical moment, as the United States government under Ronald Reagan saw little sign of weakening ties with South Africa. In fact, Reagan promoted a policy called constructive engagement, which actually emphasized staying economically and politically connected to the apartheid regime. Along with building these connections nationally, the KUKA organizers began to increase their connections throughout the state of Illinois. In the spring of 1983, the Coalition for Illinois Divestment from South Africa was formed. This organization was chaired by Prexy Nesbitt, who had become a well-known anti-apartheid voice in Chicago politics. This group focused its advocacy primarily on House Bill 0569, a state House bill which would divest Illinois pensions from South Africa. Back on campus, in August of 1983, KUKA held a joint rally with the People's Alliance for Central America, with several speakers including Prexy Nesbitt. This event focused on the theme of international solidarity against oppression. Speakers compared the repression under South Africa's apartheid government to Pinochet's regime in Chile. Pinochet, for those who don't know, came to power by overthrowing democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende. In his speech, Nesbitt drew a comparison between the right-wing forces that attacked Allende and those that opposed Harold Washington, the first black mayor of Chicago. And this was not the only example of international solidarity being highlighted by anti-apartheid organizers. For instance, within the records of the UIUC movement, I could find a few examples of parallels being drawn between apartheid South Africa and Israel, dating from the 1980s. One event in Gregory Hall, titled Relationships and Parallels Between Israel and South Africa, included a speaker from the National Conference of Black Lawyers, Adrian Wing. Another included speaker David Nadaba, a student at Morehouse College and a member of the ANC. Today, comparisons between Israel and apartheid South Africa are pretty common, especially as many human rights organizations have labeled Israel as an apartheid state. But these events show that such comparisons are not something brand new, and they've been happening for decades, including from anti-apartheid organizers from South Africa and from the United States. During this period in the early 1980s, KUKA's newsletter Amandla was also launched. The term Amandla is a Xhosa and Zulu word for power, which was commonly used by the ANC and other organizations as a rallying cry. Amandla served to keep people informed about what was happening in the anti-apartheid movement and propagate their perspective. For a while, the focus of this newsletter and KUKA as a whole was working with the Coalition for Illinois Divestment from South Africa on House Bill 0569. But eventually this piece of legislation would fail in May of 1984, so the coalition redirected its focus back to campus. The following years would consist of unprecedented levels of engagement, escalation, and frustration around the university's divestment policy. Alongside the failure of this House bill, another event which drew attention back to UIUC was the surprise visit of the U of I men's gymnastics team to South Africa. Not only did this visit violate the sports boycott advocated for by the anti-apartheid movement, but all of their expenses were paid for by the South African government, which was described by Amandla as wining and dining the athletes. As these frustrations grew, KUKA continued to advocate through the official channels of the University of Illinois system. And towards the end of 1984, in a November Board of Trustees meeting, the coalition put on a performance that was pretty well received. And the board actually voted 8-1 to study the financial and social consequences of divestment. The only black member of the Board of Trustees, Al Logan, helped push this through. Outside of the student trustees, who at the time did not hold a binding vote, Al Logan was the most outspoken advocate of divestment on the board. Another way the anti-apartheid movement amplified its presence in the official channels of student engagement was the increased involvement of the Student Government Association. Particularly, the victory of the off-center slate was important to this. Off-center rejected the approach of student government, which aimed to stay more politically neutral. Their positions included fighting sexism on campus, running more candidates who were not from Greek life and were from minority groups, and supporting divestment from apartheid. The newly elected student government president, Rhonda Kurtz, also played an important role in pushing for divestment. So, by the end of the 1985 school term, the Student Government Association would call for another referendum on divestment. This referendum's results would look even better for the anti-apartheid organizers, with a higher turnout and around 2/3 support for divestment. After the vote, President Kurtz held true to her promise of representing students, and SGA created an ad hoc committee on divestment, which began meeting with university administrators to show SGA's support for the issue. In one meeting, student representatives asked UVI President Stanley Eikenberry, now the namesake of Eikenberry Commons on campus, to explain his position on divestment. However, Eikenberry refused to say why he opposed removing the university's funds from companies invested in South Africa. In response, a rally was planned for May 8th. It was a bit of a different kind of action, a nighttime candle-lit vigil, and it attracted hundreds of protesters who quietly chanted "Divest Now." Later in the evening, a smaller group of around 200 people went to President Eikenberry's residence, once again demanding an explanation for his opposition to divestment. As he once again refused to answer, organizers continued to protest throughout the rest of finals week. So, under a huge amount of pressure, the Board of Trustees, who met in the Illini Union in May, decided to schedule a special session in June to vote on divestment. This special session meeting was going to happen in Chicago and outside of the school year, but it still attracted a notable presence from the anti-apartheid movement. Alongside people from the anti-apartheid movement in Chicago, several organizers from Champaign-Urbana, including then-sophomore Jeff Machada, carpooled north to attend. Ultimately, after hours of stalling and debate, Paul Pittman, the student trustee, as well as Al Logan and Ann Smith, voted in favor of divestment. However, all of the other members of the board voted no. In response to the failure of this motion to divest, a few students began to chant "Divest Now." As more people joined them, the attendees turned protesters began to surround the trustees. Several of them ended up being arrested. But even as the arrests began, they kept chanting. And eventually the Board of Trustees called a recess so the arrests could be completed without interrupting the session. After this was all over, 16 people, including 4 UIUC students, were arrested. One of them was Jeff Machada. While the charges were eventually dropped on these protesters, the UIUC students did face disciplinary action back at home. And this kind of response was not unique to UIUC. Across the country, students were protesting and escalating their actions for divestment. Between April and September of 1985, there were almost 3,000 students arrested nationwide for civil disobedience. And as students came back on campus after the summer, they wanted to keep their momentum. Some of these students at Champaign-Urbana formed a new organization, the Divest Now Coalition, which was an offshoot of KUKA. It included a diverse group of students from different organizations and perspectives, united by their desire to see UIUC completely divest from corporations which do business in South Africa. This organization was modeled after another Divest Now coalition, or DNC, at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Alongside their goal of divestment, they established a goal of fighting racism in their own communities, which they viewed as linked to the racist system of apartheid their government and university supported. The DNC and KUKA worked together, sharing the same room in the Illini Union. Like KUKA, the DNC participated in conferences and built connections with organizers across the country. But they differed in their approaches to escalatory direct actions, which was reflected in their membership. KUKA had more older members, professors, and members of the community, while the DNC was made up of younger undergraduates, willing to take personal risks to achieve their goals. Towards the end of 1985, trustee Al Logan once again brought up a motion on divestment, which was once again voted down by the board. The trustees instead decided to hold a retreat at Allerton Park in February of 1986. This decision was viewed by anti-apartheid organizers more as a tactic for stalling for time rather than a genuine attempt at engagement. The board was not modifying their position on the policy of divestment, and student organizers were increasingly ready to do whatever it takes to change that. I'll play a little bit from the words of Jeff Machada to describe one idea that UIUC organizers would become drawn to in 1986.
What we chose to do was claim the public space of the quad as a place to protest. We had done talks, we had done educationals, we had done all that other stuff. So we created a series of shanty towns, and this was again a tactic that was used at Columbia University, it was used at Berkeley, lots of different places. Some of us were, some members of the Divest Now Coalition were drinking at Trino's, which is now long gone, and decided that, hey, what we should do is build a shanty. We're going to take it to Follinger Auditorium, we're going to chain it there, and then we'll see what happens.
These shantytowns would become the most visible escalation of the anti-apartheid movement, and coincide with the largest mass engagement of any period of UIUC's anti-apartheid campaign. The first shantytown was established on April 8, 1986. I've read some conflicting accounts about where exactly the shantytowns were, which I think stems from the fact that there was multiple of them and they may have moved locations. But either way, they were all located on the main quad, and from what I can tell, the first one began near the Illini Union and was later moved towards Fullinger. This first shantytown immediately drew a huge amount of attention from students and faculty on campus. Organizers would hand out leaflets at the shantytown explaining their positions on divestment, and some of them later recalled that once someone was handed a flyer, just a little bit later, that person would be helping you hand out leaflets too. So it was very easy to get new people involved and engaged through this shantytown. And it also helped create a sense of community, with organizers constantly talking, strategizing, and getting to know each other. This energy continued to build in the lead up to the Board of Trustees meeting on April 10th, which would be held once again on the UI campus in the Illini Union. Before the meeting, the university demanded that the shantytown be moved towards Fullinger after the meeting's conclusion, and be totally removed from the quad by noon on Saturday, April 12th. After all, this weekend was Mom's Weekend, and the board couldn't afford to have any visiting families confronted with the reality of UIUC's investments in apartheid. In response to this demand, one protester remarked that the shantytown would be there until UIUC divested. And when the Board of Trustees arrived on campus, there were reportedly over 1,000 protesters there, many of whom had been occupying the Illini Union building. They began flooding the hallway outside the room the Board of Trustees were meeting in, chanting "Divest now." In an attempt to quiet things down, the board invited 3 members of the DNC to give remarks in the meeting. So they did, making their case and calling for a vote on divestment. Then, the Board of Trustees proceeded to completely ignore them. In response, the DNC members once again began chanting "Divest now." Then, in another recurring theme for the anti-apartheid movement, the protesting students were arrested during the Board of Trustees meeting. But things wouldn't just calm down and go smoothly from there. In order to escort these 3 students out, the police would have to go through a now incredibly crowded hallway of protesters. And as these protesters saw their comrades being taken out in handcuffs, they began to surround the police cars and do everything they could to prevent them from being escorted out. In response, police conducted mass arrests of any student they would block their way, ultimately arresting 60 people. Meanwhile, the Board of Trustees decided to postpone their meeting. Following these events, there would be an outpouring of support for the arrested protesters. Professor Donald Crumney, director of the African Studies Department, was able to raise $15,000 for their legal defense, comparing the protesters to others employing nonviolent resistance like Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi. And even the Champaign County Democratic Party was in support of them. But to circle back to the shantytown, there was now a face-off between the protesters and the administration in the build-up to the deadline for taking down the shantytown. The protesters continued to occupy the space until that time on Saturday, but ultimately they did decide to take down the shantytown. According to spokesperson Lisa Dixon, who was photographed a few days prior being escorted out of the union by police, they did this to avoid the additional risks that the administration was threatening. However, the shantytown would not be taken down without a performance, a little bit of theater, as you will. The Chancellor had a press conference scheduled for 11 a.m., 1 hour before the shantytown was supposed to be taken down. During this time, protesters put on a symbolic display. Some dressed as South African police, attacking the shantytown and other protesters who were acting as the inhabitants. Some even dressed up as politicians, handing the police officers money for their behavior. In the end, when the Chancellor came to deliver his remarks, he pretended that nothing out of the ordinary was going on. But to observers, he appeared in front of a field of people lying down playing dead, and was surrounded by the police officers and politicians who had destroyed the shantytown. I have to say, when I heard this story, I was very impressed. Sure, it seems a little bit silly, but this kind of imagery in theater is kind of hard to find anywhere else. So ultimately, the first shantytown was taken down, and the following 2 in April and May attracted a lot less attention. But this shantytown action was still incredibly pivotal in the movement for divestment. And as many of you have already been thinking, I can't not mention the fact that this moment has a great deal of parallels with today. In 1985 and 1986, there was a movement across the country demanding divestment from apartheid. The same thing exists today for the movement for divestment from the Israeli occupation. In both cases, organizers established structures in high-profile locations on their campus with symbolic meaning as a form of protest. Back then, it was the shantytowns, which symbolized the poor living conditions of black South Africans. Today it's encampments, made up primarily of tents, symbolizing the fact that many people in Gaza are being pushed out of their homes, and hundreds of thousands of them are seeking refuge wherever they can. Both back then and today, the spark of this movement was these kind of occupations of public space at high-profile elite institutions like Columbia. And later on, these tactics spread to other universities and campuses across the country. Both movements helped build a sense of community and faced police repression and arrest. I could go on, but I think you get the point. It's hard to miss how similar these moments really are. But of course, there were some differences in how the policy changes at the national level played out around the time of the shantytown movements compared to the encampments today. By the end of 1986, there were some major shifts for the anti-apartheid movement at the national level. Over the summer, the massive University of California system voted to divest $3.1 billion in what was then the largest ever divestment from South Africa. By August, U.S. Congress had passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which imposed sanctions on South Africa. While it would be vetoed by Ronald Reagan, there were enough votes to overturn his veto, signaling that a clear consensus had been reached by the nation's political elites. It was time for apartheid to end, and the U.S. to finally do something about it. Back on the UIUC campus, President Eikenberry himself proposed a motion for divestment to the Board of Trustees in September of 1986. He made a pragmatic case that with other schools divesting, the value of these stocks would drop, and that continuing to hold them would harm UIUC's public image. Once again, the Board of Trustees voted it down, but it was much closer than previous votes. At this point, several new Board of Trustees members would be elected, with anti-apartheid organizers in Illinois coordinating to support candidates that would favor divestment. The tide was clearly turning, and it was only a matter of time before some change would come. Then, on January 14, 1987, the Board of Trustees voted to begin the divestment of $3.3 million from apartheid South Africa. Early in this episode, you may have remembered that I said UIUC had close to $4 million invested in companies doing business in South Africa. So if that 4 million number had been maintained, this would have been a significant amount of divestment. However, by this point, the University of Illinois Foundation's funds included $21 million invested in South Africa, which made up almost a fifth of their total investments. So why did the board's divestment only include a small sum of $3.3 million? Well, they used a little bit of a workaround. Big companies like General Motors and IBM had come up with the Sullivan principles to evade divestment, and they now had a new strategy. They would pursue selective sales of their subsidiaries in South Africa, handing the ownership over to South Africans. But they would keep the licensing agreements with these new owners and ensure that their products would still be used and sold in the country. A spokesperson for the South African embassy said at the time that, quote, "In the short term, the sale of U.S. subsidiaries is unlikely to have any effect at all, and in the medium term, the impact is likely to be negligible." Organizers like Jeff Machada agreed, saying that at the time it kind of felt like a loss, with this fake disinvestment obscuring the financial reality that these companies still operated in South Africa. So it was through this financial maneuvering that the number of 3.3 million was reached for divestment. It excluded General Motors and IBM, who had been primary targets of the divestment movement. And the justification for this was that these companies had sold their subsidiaries. But this partial divestment was viewed differently by different people. Most everyday people who were less in the know about these little financial details viewed it as a massive victory for the divestment movement. Others, including the core organizers of the movement, saw it more as a failure to achieve their goal. But either way you see it, this would be the end of the road for UIUC's anti-apartheid divestment movement. The Divest Now coalition would dissolve soon after, and while KUKA would continue for a few more years until 1989, its activity would decrease significantly. With the federal government and the UIUC administration seemingly changing their policy, most people on campus did not see the need for more organizing to change things. But even if this conclusion was not the ideal goal of the divestment movement, organizers at UIUC still had a lot to be proud of. Their movement was part of an international effort that, in a few years' time, would succeed at ending apartheid. In 1990, Nelson Mandela was freed from prison, and negotiations would begin to end the apartheid system. Then, in 1994, the first elections with equal political rights would be held in South Africa, and Nelson Mandela and the ANC would easily sweep to victory. So, to wrap up this episode, I want to play a little bit more of the interview I did with Professor Barnes, where we discuss some of the implications of this movement and then get to my own conclusions on the topic. Today, there are several movements for divestment on campus. There's, I think, probably most relevant to this conversation, the movement for divestment from companies that are involved in the Israeli occupation of Palestine, but there's also a movement for divestment relating to fossil fuels, fossil fuel companies.
Right.
And I was just wondering if there were any specific parallels between these current movements and historic movements that you think are particularly relevant.
I think this is a case of people developing strategies that really come from the anti-apartheid movement, and I think it's a great strategy. It still does connect people across international borders around very tangible goals that everyone can see. What I mean, everyone can see. I mean, you can. It connects a critique of capital accumulation with a desire for more justice in a particular society. And sometimes those are two very abstract things. So the divestment movement makes those very abstract ideas into very concrete, measurable goals. That said, I think that the the international economy has really diversified and become more complex since the 1970s and the 1980s. I mean, as I was saying before, in the 1970s, people were just coming up with this concept of transnational corporations. You know, today we've got these massive conglomerates that have been strengthened by, 30 or 40 years of the best efforts that the graduates of business schools like ours could produce to try to make those ties more difficult to find. International finance has completely shifted now to the internet, to being online, to being instantaneous trading and stuff in ways that didn't exist in the 1970s and the 1980s. If, for example, now you want to look to see, does my university, whatever it is, does my university invest in, say, defense, the arms industry in Israel? That's more difficult to find out now than it would have been in the 70s and the 80s with South Africa, because funds are held in conglomerates, they're held in mutual funds, they're held in funds of funds. I mean, the whole thing has been, I think, partly in response to the success of the divestment movements of the 70s and 80s. Things have been made much more difficult to track and to trace now. So the strategy is still a good one, but capitalism is ever developing and shifting, and kind of a moving target in some ways.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about all the complexities of this. I mean, that's, I think, why disclosure has also become kind of a demand of the divestment movement, right? Because it's harder to ask for divestment if you don't even know what to divest from or how much of it there is. I guess another thing that comes to mind is its power was not just as financial impact, but as a symbolic kind of move, because especially with the level of complexities and everything in the modern economy, the simple act of divesting some number of millions or however much money it is isn't necessarily going to cripple the economy. I mean, it could have an impact if done enough places, but it is a very symbolic sign of not involving yourself in this system.
Right. What I was reading was that it did have, the divestment movement did encourage, and that it also happened on a couple of different tracks, but it did encourage some companies to leave South Africa. When that happened, the South African currency lost value. When that happened, I mean, there was a knock-on effect. So it wasn't just that stocks were going to be sold. It was that some of the economic support of the apartheid system was going to be withdrawn, and one thing, things started moving in tandem, so that the South African economy started to, I'm not sure I would say crash, but it started to have real difficulties, and part of that was the withdrawal of American investment. Not all of it, but some of it. At the same time that there was increasing political pressure, both inside and outside the country, on the apartheid system. So things started to work in harmony, if you can put it that way, in terms of withdrawing political, economic, moral support for the apartheid government by the end of the 1980s.
Yeah, that seems to also, coincide with you mentioned earlier, the international kind of movement, including sanctions, which were also eventually applied by the United States. In terms of UIUC stories, the sanctions were implemented in the United States in '86, and UIUC divested the next year. Previously, the United States had vetoed United Nations efforts to impose sanctions and things like this. So that seems to also kind of add another lever being pulled against apartheid, so to speak.
Right. The thing I just want to say before you leave all this is just to emphasize how long all of this took.
Yes.
That I was reading something on the website of the Congressional Black Caucus about how, they date the beginnings of the efforts to impose sanctions on South Africa from 1959, and it took all the way until 1980. Not every session of, it took a long time to achieve that. This was a long struggle. I think sometimes we focus on 1987 and say, ta-da, but in fact, those networks did reinforce each other by the end of the 80s. But, one group of people had to hand the struggle off to the next group of people, especially on college campuses, over the course of 10, 15, 20 years, in order to achieve even that small amount of divestment that happened on our campus, which, it was something, it was symbolic, it was a victory. It allowed people to say we forced our campus to be on the right side of history. It was partial, but it was significant. So, but it took a long time to achieve.
I definitely do want to emphasize that theme of the length of the movement. Even, of course, internationally and in many other places, this was a struggle that spanned many more decades. But the UIUC campus specifically, it really got going in the late 70s and went until the late 80s. And that, decade had so much turnover of people in the student movement. There were professors or community members that were around the whole time, based more or less, but a lot of continuity was lost at various points, or there were moments of downturn just because, seniors graduated and didn't adequately train new people to take their footsteps, which I think is a recurring issue in student movements.
Yeah, but then the point is that it did happen, and part of the reason that it did happen was because people did train younger people, and that also, I think that's a tradition that's important, whether or not there was, X amount of divestment or not. That idea that, each one teaches one, which is a South African saying. That makes a continuity with what we're seeing, what we see today. That the idea that, how does a movement try to sustain itself is an organizational question that every generation has to answer. And, you, as they say, you learn from the one before. Yeah,
absolutely. That kind of development as an organizer is important, regardless of whether you immediately achieve your goal as in your time there. You can go on to do all kinds of other things, politically and otherwise after that. And while I did mention, the fact that seniors leaving could create issues in certain times, I think that the movement was able to maintain continuity and strength over time, even if there are some years where you're not as strong because of a specific group leaving. So I don't want to act like that was some, huge issue or something, more so than it was in this, because the Champaign-Urbana Coalition Against Apartheid lasted for a long time, and there was other groups as well, but that was the biggest one. And it was, I think, a big strength of it was that it had faculty members and people in the community who were there, on a stable basis and did not end up leaving, to kind of anchor and help keep things going and over time, which I think is another thing I guess we should definitely keep in mind. And then, there's also the fact that even after divestment in '87, it still took several more years of negotiations and everything, and before the eventual formal end of apartheid. So I guess to end things off, my question is just kind of, are there any other important lessons you think we can learn from the struggle against apartheid, and specifically, I guess, towards the end of that struggle and how long it took to happen?
Well, I'm a historian, so I guess I want to say that I hope that people like yourself, are really interested in doing your own research to answer this question. I have been very struck by the fact that it's taken people in South Africa a long time to actually come to grips with their own, in a sense, with their own relatively recent history. So, there isn't, for example, a large literature even now on what it was like to live in South Africa in the 1980s, which was a period of intensive repression and difficulty and struggle and detention without trial, and so many parts of South Africa were just on fire in the 1980s. But they're not really that many books about this. People who lived through it will tell you that. I mean, I sort of watched it from across the border in Zimbabwe to some extent, but I think people's experiences were so profound and so painful that they don't want to go back and talk about it, and they don't even want to kind of think about it. So we've got some cliches and some larger narratives that in some ways are accurate, but it takes a long time for people to actually be able, and historians to be able to reflect on a period of such upheaval. So, the book literally has not yet been written on the end of apartheid, even though we kind of know what happened. We know the role that Nelson Mandela played. We know the role, the role that people like Winnie Mandela played. Many people have written their memoirs, people who were involved, South Africans who were involved either internally or externally in the anti-apartheid struggle. We have a whole bunch of political timelines. There's not a lot of kind of synthesizing work on kind of the tenor of that particular decade. So people who are in universities now, people who are thinking about history, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in conjunction with people in South Africa to really flesh out memories and analyses, more than one analysis, of those particular years. Americans have a lot to learn from people in other parts of the world. We are often just relentlessly focused on ourselves, but ourselves as Americans and what our problems are, and Lord knows we got a lot of them. But I have found that when people do the work to make their imaginations and their consciousness really stretch across those international borders, widening one's perspective is so helpful and so useful. Learning from people in other parts of the world and learning with people in other parts of the world is really important, largely because it helps us as Americans understand how other people see our society, and then you're stepping into someone else's shoes to look back at yourself, and that's a really powerful exercise. So, part of the anti-apartheid movement was also part of, for example, the anti-Vietnam War movement. I mean, which was pretty much wrapping up by the time the anti-apartheid struggle came along in the middle of the 1970s. But the whole idea of America as an imperialist power, even though Americans are taught that there is no American empire as such, we're not taught anything about our histories with Cuba, about our histories with Puerto Rico. We're not taught anything about that, but the continuities there of America's role in the world, it's really important for us to learn that. And the anti-apartheid struggle did a lot, I think, to educate Americans on that particular topic, just as the current BDS movement to isolate Israel because of its settler colonialism in its own part of the world. I think it's a really crucial step for people to understand where America sits in the world and what our ties are with other nations and states who have histories that are so much like our own.
I think Professor Barnes is exactly right to point to the similarities in settler colonialism in the United States, South Africa, and Israel. There are plenty of differences, sure, but in each country, through various times in history, the dominant groups of settlers have stolen land and violently attacked the indigenous people living there. Understanding this, it's not a surprise that apartheid South Africa, the United States, and Israel were close allies. It's also not surprising that post-apartheid South Africa has been so outspoken against the recent actions of Israel. But beyond these geopolitical similarities, there are a few other things I want to point out that really struck me about this movement, and I think they can be useful to judge the strength of divestment, anti-colonial, and anti-racist movements today. One thing that I think is really important is looking at how the university administration responds to social movements. Of course, every campus is different, but I think there are some trends you can notice from the University of Illinois' administration's response to the anti-apartheid movement. And I think these things can apply to movements elsewhere in time and place. Of course, the primary response UIUC had was to reject the demand of anti-apartheid organizers and repress their attempts to draw attention to the struggle against apartheid. But when they did make concessions, it would often be as drawn out as possible, stalling for time and making the smallest possible changes they could. Sure, sometimes there are sweeping moves towards divestment. But at UIUC, the Board of Trustees kept taking these smaller steps with the hope that they would make organizers think that they had won and stop bothering them. But luckily at U of I, the anti-apartheid movement mostly recognized this stalling tactic for what it was and kept consistent in their push for divestment. This meant continuing to train new organizers, never letting the movement or organization die, and pushing for semester after semester. Of course, towards the very end of the movement, partial divestment and the national political climate was enough to convince most people that they had won, and the movement did eventually die down. Another thing I want to note about the administration's response is that it's often full of contradictions. They'll say they don't like apartheid, but there's nothing they can do about it, seemingly ignoring the anti-apartheid movement's very clear demand for how they can make a change: divestment. This reminded me a lot of a recent UIUC mass mail, where they said, quote, "Our community is not responsible for the progression of this conflict, and we do not have the power to end this devastating war, no matter how much we wish we could." Unquote. So this kind of rhetorical strategy deliberately misses the point being made by organizers. No one claimed that UIUC could solely put an end to apartheid, or that UIUC could end Israel's violence towards Palestinians. But the university is a powerful and influential institution, and they have a lot of resources, including their investment portfolio, which could be reallocated in a way that disconnects them from those committing racist and colonial violence. By shifting the goalposts to whether or not the university can stop the entire conflict, the administration is avoiding addressing this question of divestment. So fundamentally, I think the divestment movement exposes the university's lack of commitment to their stated ideals. If you remember back to episode 0, where I talked about the kind of purpose of this podcast, I mentioned exploring these contradictions between what UIUC claims to stand for and what it actually does. In this case, the University of Illinois claimed that it stood against apartheid, but they maintained their very profitable investments that helped perpetuate apartheid. So I just want to emphasize that I think it's really important, as someone who talks about university politics, to be able to recognize when the administration's commitments are just rhetorical and when they are real, and call out when they don't live up to their supposed principles. One last thing that really stood out to me looking through the archives was how kind of normal everything was. There were handwritten notes scribbled on the back of random pieces of paper, disagreements and internal struggles documented in meeting discussions, and plenty of other things that any organizer today would be familiar with. I mentioned this because I think it's easy to valorize movements of the past and put people up on a pedestal. That's not to say these movements aren't worth admiring, but often when looking at historical struggles, the focus is on people like Martin Luther King Jr. or Nelson Mandela, who are seen as these untouchable leaders. And there's always going to be leaders of movements who are more visible. But the vast majority of organizing work that underpins movements is done by everyday people. People who have jobs, families, friends, and lives outside of organizing, but take time out of their day, sometimes even a lot of time, to contribute to a cause they believe in. And I think that's one of the most important lessons of all we can take from this movement. Change only happens when everyday people commit their time and energy to organizing for it. So I guess the closing message I have is that if you're not already to get involved in this kind of organizing, think about an issue that you're passionate about and join an organization that you believe in to make this kind of change. As many of you might know, I'm a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, which, by the way, I did find in the archives was part of the Coalition for Illinois Divestment from South Africa back in the 80s. And that's just one example of the many organizations that today are fighting for things like divestment and other demands across the country. So, if you out there are interested in making a change, I'd encourage you to do something similar. As always, thank you so much for listening to the Learning and Labor podcast. Bye-bye.
Learning and Labor. Station WILL has carried a special program this week giving information about the University of Illinois. If you have been a listener to these broadcasts, you have heard more or less about what the university does, how it does it, and what it hopes to do. Thank you, Dr. Willard.